Okay, so hey everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I am zooming to you this evening from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, being located in Sydney this semester. I pay my respects to them and to all First Nations people whose lands have never been ceded. I also pay my respects to all those who live modestly on country as carers and custodians. For those of you who don't know me, my name, I think you all know me, but those of you watching the YouTube video, my name is Munif. I teach and research in the English program at the ANU, and I'm the co-director with Julianne Lamond of the Centre for Australian Literary Cultures, also known as CALC. CALC is an ANU research centre focused on raising the visibility of Australian literature in Australia and beyond. I'm very happy, full of happiness to welcome Dr. Meg Brayshaw. Meg is the John Rowe Lecturer in Australian Literature at the University of Sydney. Meg researches and teaches Australian literature, and her particular scholarly interests are in literary engagements with place, climate, and sustainability. Meg has also published on Australian modernism and in the field of urban literary studies. Her book, Sydney and Its Waterway in Australian Literary Modernism, was published by Palgrave in 2021. Among other published book chapters and articles, Meg's chapter on women writers and the emerging urban novel, 1930 to 1952, appears in the very recently published The Cambridge History of the Australian Novel. Tonight, Meg is presenting a paper from what I believe is a new research project, and the paper is titled Dymphna Cusack's Resourceful Melodrama, Carbon Capitalism and the Fossil Unconscious in Southern Steel. I ask you to please mute the microphones on your computers or devices. And again, please keep in mind that this event is being recorded and a version of the recording will be uploaded to the CALC page on the ANU website. So Meg, please share your screen, not screen, your screen.
Okay, can everybody see that okay? Great.
Yep.
Okay, so before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose unceded lands I'm on this evening, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to thank Monique for inviting me to give this paper and for prompting me to think about Cusack in relation to melodrama, which has really opened up my thinking on this novel. So set in the Australian coalopolis turned steel city of Newcastle through the most anxious months of the Pacific War, Dymphna Cusack's Southern Steel contrasts the lives of those who benefit from coal-fired industry with the struggles of those who are victimised by them. The novel opens as Bar Sweetapple, a brilliant young metallurgist climbing the ranks at the city's leading steelmaking corporation, returns to his hometown in a private aeroplane. Access to this modern, most carbon-intensive mode of transport is confirmation of the place Bar has made for himself as a key beneficiary of Newcastle's fossil-fueled economy. Seeing the crude, bustling, expanding city spread out below him, Bar is filled with a sense of exaltation. Newcastle represents wealth and power, and he is helping to make it. Far below Bar's plane, his brother Landy works as a fireman in the stokehole of a ship transporting iron ore for steel production. Landy's blackened hands speak to his close contact with the raw material that produces Bar's wealth and power, coal. Looking older than his 22 years, wearing sweat-soaked flannel and dirty dungarees, Landy ascends to the deck of the Steel Duke only to see weathered tombstones and the sheer black cliffs of Fort Scratchley. These Gothic symbols foreshadow Landy's eventual death. The smoke from his coal-fired ship will make it an easier target for Japanese torpedoes than oil-driven Navy vessels. The two brothers embody the duplicitous promise of coal as both liberatory power and Stygian terror. High up in the pressurized cabin of the aeroplane, separated from the material sources and negative consequences of the wealth and power he enjoys, Bar represents carbon capitalism's exuberant surface, while Landy, shoveling coal in the stokehole of a ship destined for destruction, is a reminder of its grim yet usually hidden underside. This bipolar clash and contrast in the novel's opening pages epitomizes its melodramatic mode, which resources Cusack's realist fiction with the means to dramatize the primal ethical conflict of fossil fuel modernity. When James Watt perfected the steam engine in the late 18th century and successfully wrenched mechanical power from coal, this marriage of science, carbon, and capital sired an economy of self-sustaining growth predicated on the growing consumption of fossil fuels. This promise of open-ended progress also inaugurated new horrors, from mortal harm in coal mines dug ever deeper and more dangerously into the earth to widespread ecological collapse. As Frederick Buell writes, carbon capitalism ushered in an age of exuberance that was simultaneously haunted by catastrophe. This is a dialectic that can be traced back to the materiality of coal itself, be it Promethean coal that gave humanity its new modes of and uses for fire, or Stygian coal that recreated the ancient fiery nether region as polluted industrial district and city. Enthralled by the rich emancipatory qualities of hydrocarbons, Western cultures have increasingly repressed knowledge of their harms. In Bob Johnson's formulation, the fossil unconscious is the repressed underside of carbon capitalism. Populated by terrors, neuroses, and pain, the fossil unconscious traces back to our economy's sacrifice zones, its spaces of economic morbidity, its demented ecologies, and its generation of blocked desires. As Johnson's language here makes clear, the fossil unconscious is a fundamentally melodramatic concept, and it usefully illuminates the mode's functioning in Southern Steel. When Barr spots the Steel Duke from his private plane and remembers that his younger brother is a fireman on the ship, the exultation he felt at seeing Newcastle spread out below him is pricked. For Barr, Landy's profession is an unpleasant reminder not only of his own working-class origins, but also of the origins of his wealth and power in the messy, laborious, dangerous business of turning coal into energy. In other words, the thought of Landy and the Steel Duke is a momentary breach of the fossil unconscious. Drawing on Peter Brook's influential reading of melodrama as a piercing of repression that functions as the principal mode for uncovering, demonstrating, and making operative the essential moral universe in a post-sacred era, in this paper, I argue that in Southern Steel, Cusack harnesses the melodramatic mode to bring the fossil unconscious to the surface of her realism, forcing recognition of carbon capitalism's multifaceted harms and ethical failings. Critics in the humanities have begun the work of untangling the deep yet occulted functioning of fossil fuels in our symbolic cultures. Imre Zeman argues that the imaginative resources of literature are always already linked to the use of physical resources, while Johnson maintains that fossil fuels manifest as the energies that drive our cultural text below the register of plot and supply the elemental ground to our fiction. Graeme MacDonald offers one of the most articulated models of an energy-aware literary criticism in his research note on the resources of fiction, calling for closer consideration of the relationship between fossil fuels and what he names narrative energetics, the physical and aesthetic forms and variants of energy resources, fueling and powering actions, events, and storylines and textual structures. As a particularly potent system of narrative energetics, with origins that can be meaningfully linked to fossil fuels, melodrama is ripe for energy-attentive critical engagement. Arguing that the use of extraction-based lighting technologies contributed to early-stage melodrama's moral economy of bright virtue and dark vice, Devin Griffiths reads melodrama as both powered by and reflective of the energy regimes that drive modernity. Tracing the petrodrama from the Victorian stage to the Hollywood film, Griffiths shows how melodrama treats energy culture as both thematic content and a problem. In her reading of the film Kala Pattar as a coal melodrama, Debashri Mukherjee attends to the entangled materialities of human and non-human in sentimental stories about coal, connecting the film's dramatization of the extraction of fossil fuels and the extraction of labor from the human body with the sentimental extraction that the melodramatic film affects on the viewer. Griffiths and Mukherjee focus on stage and film melodrama. In this paper, I extend the discussion to the melodramatic mode in narrative fiction, and specifically in the realist novel. My formulation of resourceful melodrama reflects two main suppositions on which my argument is predicated. First, following Christine Gledhill, I recognise that melodrama resources otherwise realist depictions of modernity with the capacity to, quote, force into an aesthetic presence occulted moral truths not able to be captured by realism's standard conventions. Second, with reference to Griffith's claim that melodrama stages inversions in which the condition of energetic modernity becomes the content of the melodramatic form, I maintain that in Southern Steel, Cusack's melodrama reflects the material and social properties of the resource about which it is preoccupied, coal. Coal, as bringer of light and darkness, salvation and damnation, is in Cusack's novel the source of the moral Manichaeism that Brooks identifies as the crux of the melodramatic imagination. During Cusack's lifetime, critics routinely chastised her for compromising what one critic called the toughness of her apparently social realist fictions with melodramatic plots, structures, and characterization. In 1992, as the reclamation of other Australian women writers of her generation was well underway, Laurie Clancy warned that anyone wishing to resurrect Cusack's reputation and treat her as a major novelist would have to contend with her crude and literal-minded treatment of moral dilemmas and the liberal doses of romantic drama with which she smothers them. The assumption here is that Cusack's fictions are fundamentally social realist, but frequently and sometimes fatally destabilized by that crutch of the lesser writer, melodrama. Productive readings of Cusack's work proceed from an understanding of melodrama as a central tenet of her fictional method and not a compromising incursion upon it. Cusack's novels dramatise the struggle of modernity's victims against what she saw as outsized forces for evil in the world, including racism, sexual double standards, neo-Nazism, and most abidingly, poverty and inequality wrought by capitalism, which she glossed as the system. As Gledhill explains, when the realist novel extends representation to marginalised groups, ways of life, and area of experience that demand recognition, it draws on the means of projecting energies, imaginaries, and social perceptions offered by melodrama's modality. Having first achieved success as a playwright, Cusack's understanding of this modality was essentially theatrical, and she reached for it in fiction when the conventions of realism failed to adequately dramatise the primal ethical forces about which her work dealt. To illustrate this point, we can consider the body of work Cusack produced from the 2 years she spent in Newcastle from early 1942. Cusack's melodramatic imagination was clearly sparked by Australia's industrial centre. With its ugliness, its exploitation, its gallantry, she wrote to Miles Franklin, the city was a perfect epitome of the whole bloody system. It was also marginalised in the national imaginary. Since its founding, historian Nancy Cushing writes, Newcastle had been regarded as a site for those functions which Sydney society preferred to see other than itself, including coal mining and industry. To mark Newcastle's sesquicentenary in 1947, Cusack wrote a pair of plays for the ABC that detailed the city's development from coal to steel, with an emphasis on the horror and injustice wrought by this apparent progress and the bravery of ordinary people in the face of it. Mixing historical reenactment with music and commentary, the plays include scenes of devastating violence wreaked by satanic guards against the Irish political prisoners who were among the first to extract coal and other resources from the area under the threat of the lash. Cusack reanimates the ghost of James Fletcher, a coal miner and early trade unionist, to articulate the twinned exuberance and catastrophe embedded in the city's most important commodity. Oh aye, coal spells power, he says, and it spells other things in its time. Strife and exploitation, bitterness, disaster, and poverty. In Australia, coal has always served as more than a source of energy, having shored up the settler colonial state almost since its beginning. One can trace a straight line from the first export of coal in 1799, which prompted Governor King to proclaim the hydrocarbon the first natural produce of the colony that has tended to any advantage, to then Treasurer Scott Morrison hoisting a lump of coal in Parliament in 2017 and declaring it the source of the nation's prosperity. 70 years before Morrison's exuberant performance, Cusack confronts her listeners in a climate of post-war optimism with an image of the blood of the white intruder spattered on gleaming coal. Encrypted here are the violent processes of both mining and settler colonialism. Preserving the play's polarised dynamics, spectacular violence, and speech laden with moral truths, Southern Steel exemplifies Cusack's theatrical approach to realist fiction. The novel even integrates music. Popular songs, classical music, and references to 5 operas underline the dramatic purpose of key scenes and add emotional weight to characters' pronouncements. In this paper, I'll show how Southern Steel, energized by the melodramatic logic of blood on gleaming coal, traces the impact of carbon capitalism on Australian modernity. Cusack's first aerial description of Newcastle as Barr's plane comes into land emphasises the role of carbon-intensive industry in shaping the city. Towering above every other natural and built feature, the smokestacks of Southern Steel and Broken Hill Proprietary, under their perpetual silver-black clouds, a sign and seal of Newcastle's existence. Notably, Cusack's Southern Steel is not a replacement for the real corporation that dominated the city for most of the 20th century, but its fictional twin, an allegorical stage on which she can play out a drama about the role of carbon capitalism in shaping human lives. Under this system, Johnson explains, the modern soul is disciplined and made present through the combustion of prehistoric carbons. Accordingly, Barr Sweetapple is completely bound up not only with the company that employs him, but with the carbon-intensive process of steelmaking itself. SS Steel, Cusack writes, is his life, and during its production, his work, his thoughts, indeed, he might even say his life, had its fullest meaning. Barr is what Gledhill calls a socio-emotional protagonist, through whose personality and physical being, Cusack explores the social force of carbon capitalism. Cusack's 6-page rendition of The Heat, in which coal as coke is burnt to produce liquid steel from pig iron and scrap, is both an accurate description of the process and an exuberant spectacle. Barr has an emotional, almost erotic reaction to a process that never ceases to both move and thrill him. With mounting excitement that tautens every nerve in his body, he watches the wildly gyrating gases and notices the air quivering in the steadily rising temperature as the furniture is charged. He admires the masculine power of the workers who stand in the presence of the full fury of the released steel without protective garments. They were men, all right, he exclaims. As Cara Daggett writes, extracting and burning fuel has most often been a practice of white masculinity, such that the explosive power of combustion could be crudely equated with virility. At the climax of The Heat, Cusack writes, here Barr exalted, here in the dazzling flood that lit the whole building, showing up the girders of the crane tracks, filling the high roof with leaping light and shadow, silhouetting the dark figure of the helper in an aura like the sun, here was the source of world power today, steel, his steel. The heightened rhetoric here reflects the exuberant promise of coal-fired energy as a Promethean power that rivals the sun. Yet this is an unstable, dangerous exuberance. When he first enters the open hearth shop, Barr is told of a worker who was badly burned and is in hospital fighting for his life. The steelworks are full of injured bodies, including a worker whose foot was crushed to a pulp, his toes all squeezed out the side of his boot like red jelly, a simile that casts the injury as both viscerally horrible and commonplace. By contrasting exuberant spectacle with Gothic injury, Cusack shows how the same carbon-intensive processes that produced in Barr what Johnson calls modern self-realization and satisfaction also generate as waste the derealization, the disability, and the labored breathing of the fossil unconscious as modernity's other. Cusack harnesses Newcastle's geography to figure the city as an enormous stage on which her characters play out the conflict between carbon capitalism and the fossil unconscious. Barr, his wife Roz, and their young son Daryl live in upper-middle-class consumerist splendour on the Ridge, an exclusive area elevated away from the city's industry. Landy and his father Hoppy board with the Boltons, an affable working-class family who live in a shabby terrace among a jumble of smutty streets and smoke-grimed buildings beside a coal-fired power station. Through melodrama's fusing of the personal and political, the family and its domestic space become charged with a symbolic potency. As an overdetermined psychic institution, Gledhill explains, the family locks onto unconscious desires and forces, allowing it to function in melodrama as a valve through which repression is released and socially unacknowledged states are publicly enacted. In Southern Steel, Cusack forces acknowledgement of the fossil unconscious by contrasting the worlds of each family. The nuclear sweet apples on the Ridge are aligned with carbon capitalism, while the sprawling Bolton clan, literally living downwind of that power, bears the brunt of its harms and inequities. Barr's wife Ros serves as what Monique Rooney calls the melodrama's aspirational subject. She participates in the consumerism that is perhaps the most important product of carbon capitalism, while repressing any knowledge of the harmful material substances and processes that underpin her upwardly mobile lifestyle. The daughter of a coal miner, Ros has striven to separate herself from the poverty, uncertainty, and dirt she knew as a child. All her girlhood, she had kept one determination in her mind, Cusack writes, to get away from the coalfields. She hated everything about them: the drab towns, the unpainted houses weathered to dirty mottled grey, poppet heads like black skeletons. Now, Ros is prepared to slave day in and day out to help Barr up the ladder at the steelworks and therefore increase her physical and psychical distance from the coalfields. The newly built house on the ridge is a further break with that background. A subtle blending of old colonial and Spanish and something that belonged unmistakably to this newer world, the house symbolises how far she's come from the dirty mottled grey houses of her childhood. During the war, the steelworks burnt 30,000 tonnes of coal a week, raising air pollution in Newcastle to unprecedented levels. Though Ros can see the workaday haze of smoke and smog from the ridge, with the clear air heavy with the scent of roses and the tang of eucalyptus, she might have been in another world. Ros's motivation as a character is singular and obsessive. She plans to make a clean sweep of everything she didn't want in their lives. Her mouth set hard. She'd see to it that it was a clean sweep. In this way, Ros spends the narrative engaged in what Johnson calls the heavy-duty scrubbing through which the fossil unconscious, as the damages and leakages of carbon capitalism, are kept off stage and out of our minds. Ros's increasingly hysterical cleaning includes sabotaging Barr's relationship with Landy and the Boltons, a coal mining family who were her childhood neighbours and therefore represent everything she wants to forget. Ironically, however, her chief means of signalling her distance from the coalfields is by engaging in what Johnson calls oil-soaked fantasies of the American dream and its global permutations. Having spent time in the US during Barr's overseas research trip, she nagged him to get a job in Pittsburgh, but when that failed, returned to Australia with clothes from New York and a big American car that eats up the road, purring effortlessly when Ros touches the accelerator. As Buell explains, oil was considered clean, efficient, and modern, as it erased or sublimated most of the highly visible evils of coal. Successfully repressing the fossil unconscious, Ros refuses to acknowledge that her petro-modern lifestyle still depends on the coalfields as the ultimate source of Barr's wealth and status. Carbon informs the material, sensory, and emotional substrata of modern lives, but does so in highly stratified ways. While Ros pursues her clean sweep, the Boltons cannot remove the physical and psychological scars they bear from living on the commodity frontiers of Australian modernity. A coal miner turned wharf labourer, Tom Bolton's face is spotted with blue marks caused by an explosion in a coal mine. His wife, Mum Bolton, still suffers from the loss of her eldest son, David, in another mining tragedy, the 1923 Bellbird disaster that left 21 coal miners dead. With her younger son now serving overseas, fear for him has brought the memory close. At the end of the day that began with Barr's triumphant return home via aeroplane, Mum recreates the disaster in an emotionally wrought monologue that sends the narrative down into the depths and darkness of the fossil unconscious. The recount is preceded by a moment of mute pathos as Mum struggles to make Tom and Hoppy comprehend her pain as a suffering mother. She stood looking from one to the other, her hands pressed down on the table, the passion gone out of her face, bewilderment in her eyes, her face a picture of uncomprehending sorrow. In this moment, Mum becomes the melodrama's moral touchstone, through whom the contradictions of capitalism are negotiated. Accordingly, her recount begins by explaining that coal mining originally brought the family prosperity. Tom got a job in the mine, and David was taken on, though he was only 17. What with both of them earning good money, I was that happy and life was that wonderful that if you'd asked me then, I'd have told you I believed in God and all the rest of it. The disaster, however, ruined her faith. After Bellbird, I never believed in nothing again. If you ask me what I believe about heaven and hell, I tell you they was both here on earth and mainly hell after what I seen. Cusack had direct experience of the hellishness of the mines. During her tenure as a teacher in the mining town of Broken Hill during the late 1920s, she had opportunity to descend into one of the area's many lead, zinc, and silver mines run by BHP, the corporation that also owned the Newcastle Steelworks. She wrote, "I was convinced in that satanic, to me, atmosphere that no wages could adequately compensate men for spending their lives cut off from the sun and the air of a world to which they should belong. Waiting there with thudding heart for the explosions to go off, I visualized the horror of the mine disaster for which their only riposte was a day's lost pay. Forever after, the essentially appalling conditions of even good mines has seemed to me to sacrifice miners for the good of us all, too often not only without our gratitude, but without even our awareness." Cusack's anecdote precisely articulates the fossil unconscious as moral argument. Modernity's good life is underwritten by horrors that the bulk of society either does not know or represses. In Southern Steel, this argument is made by the recount of the Bellbird disaster, with Cusack heightening its moral claim by relating it through Mum Bolton, whose distinct turns of speech highlight not only her pain and grief, but also her lack of social power. It's important to note here that from 1942, illness forced Cusack to dictate all of her writing. Given that she occasionally acted in the plays she wrote, it's possible to surmise that she brought her novels into being at least partly by taking on her characters' voices as her own. This too contributes to the theatrical quality of Cusack's fiction and its reliance on speech. Mum's recount continues as she describes the moment she learned her son was dead. "Tom came running out and came over to me. He was black with coal, and there was blood running out from a cut above over his eye. Never knew how he got it. And he put his arm around me. I remember it left a big black smear around the apron and dress, and he said, 'Hold on, Mum, I got bad news for you, but everything will be all right.' As Tom's gesture of comfort transfers coal dust onto Mum Bolton's dress and apron, the Stygian terror of the mine invades the domestic sphere and marks her physical being. That black smear is upon her still as a deep psychological wound. Unlike Roz, Mum Bolton's trauma is too pronounced to repress. For years after, she says, I used to wake up sweating in a nightmare, thinking I heard the explosion again, and Tom and David down below. I never been the same since." Mum Bolton's memories also recall a cinematic memory. The image of women running to the pit top to await news of their coal mining men is also found in John Ford's Oscar-winning adaptation, How Green Was My Valley, which premiered in Australia in April 1942. In that film, a woman newly widowed by the mine looks away from the pit and towards the heavens. "He came to me just now," she says of her dead husband. "He spoke to me and told me of the glory he had seen." In Cusack's telling, Mum Bolton refuses consolation and continues to curse God. "Why couldn't he bring my David out, sealing the mine down above a bit of a boy, and him no more than begun to live?" In this scene, Cusack exploits the melodramatic tropes of nightmare states, claustration and thwarted escape, and innocence buried alive and unable to voice its claim to recognition, to force the fossil unconscious to the surface of the text. If Cusack establishes the stakes of her moral drama by contrasting the beneficiaries of coal with its victims, she resolves it by collapsing this distinction. In the novel's latter half, chaos enters the lives of all the characters, illustrating the impossibility of escaping the harms of carbon capitalism. The pace of the narrative accelerates as exuberance and catastrophe merge. This turn is most evident in the trajectories of the two brothers at the centre of the novel, as Peripetean plots see Landy move from mortal danger to wedded bliss and then to death, and Bar enter into an affair that begins with ecstasy but ends in self-disillusion. Cusack's use of increasingly bold melodramatic structures, including the spectacle of sinking ships, an ill-fated love triangle and explosive familial disputes, sees dysfunction and destruction mount to the point where the narrative energetics become entropic. As Johnson explains, the combustion of carbon has always worked to simultaneously accelerate disorder, from arming us with fossilized weaponry to disrupting the ecosystems on which life depends. This disorder is modernity's internal entropy, a destructive impulse or death drive that functions as the palpable register of a repressed fossil unconscious. In Southern Steel, the narrative's increasingly entropic energy allows the fossil unconscious full articulation. The entropic turn is marked visually in the text. At the novel's midpoint, a stop press item announcing the Japanese raid on Sydney Harbour during the night of 31 May is given in the typesetter's only use of bold print. From this point, the violence of the war begins to impinge directly on the characters' lives. Cusack understood the war as an existential threat to humanity with roots in the same system that kills miners and maims steelworkers. Mum Bolton connects David's death in the Bellbird disaster to the threat against her younger son now serving overseas. On the night Sydney is shelled, she passes by the city's monument to coal as she returns home from the air raid shelter. Erected by businessmen in 1909, the monument, a block of Italian marble fashioned to resemble coal and set on a sandstone plinth, purposefully excluded any reference to the workers who risked their safety to extract and transport the prized mineral. To Mum, the monument is an ugly old thing at any time, but now this visual representation of carbon capitalism's violent disregard for human life seems blacker and uglier than ever. The steel industry is also implicated. The corporations, one character remarks, are not making steels to give men and women a better life, but to take it from them. While Barr acknowledges the war as an underlying threat, to him it predominantly means plenty of work for Southern Steel. To Landy, transporting the materials that make that work possible, however, the war is a monstrous threat to his safety. Just days after the attack on Sydney, the Steel Duke is struck by a torpedo. In the engine room, Landy hears a crash and a roar before he is hit with a searing blast and scalding mist. There's a ripping of steel, a rending of twisting tubes, and a sheet of flame that immediately kills a fellow fireman, Shorty. The heat and energy embedded in Cusack's description present the explosion as the catastrophic twin to the exuberant spectacle of the steelmaking process, and the torpedo that causes it as the apotheosis of fiery fossil power. By the time Landy makes it to the deck, half the ship has already disappeared. During the war, ships carrying iron ore were nicknamed death ships by their crews because the weight of their cargo made them sink too quickly for lifeboats to be launched. Landy is knocked out as he jumps from the foundering ship. As the iron dust-covered water begins to close over him, his nose fills with SS raw material. More than anyone else, Johnson writes, the subterranean bodies of coal miners and their terrestrial counterparts like the coal stoker absorbed the blunt somatic impact of modernity's dependency on fossil fuels. As he sinks, Landy comes close to being suffocated by the base resources of fossil fuel modernity, the coal that placed him in the stokehold during the explosion, and the iron dust now settling in his lungs. This breathlessness is echoed by Cusack's use of suspense. Readers must wait more than 50 pages to learn of Landy's survival. Employing a dialectic of pathos and action, Cusack pairs the spectacle of the sinking with a moment of quiet emotion that illuminates the dramatic scene's moral truth. Still reeling from news of the attack, Landy's father Hoppy and his elderly friend Jummer walk in Carrington, a suburb of Newcastle closely associated with coal mining and the steelworks. Originally underwater at high tide, the area was built up by ballast from ships coming in to collect coal. To accommodate these large seagoing ships, the harbour was deepened by blasting and dredging. In other words, Carrington is a place made in the image of carbon capitalism, and it is for this reason that Cusack chooses it as the stage on which to play out a moment of moral reckoning. Attempting to distract his friend, amateur historian Jummer reminisces about the area before it was so altered by industry. He recalls fishing in the mud as a child and the sailing ships that crowded the harbour before steam power became the norm. The port was a forest of masts then, Jummer remarks. The scene continues. Most wonderful sight in the world, Hoppy agreed, looking across the leaden gleam of water, seeing not the bulk of the wheat silos on the opposite shore, the rusty hulls of the cargo boats burnt orange in the westering sun, the black fingers of the loading cranes along the dyke weaving a futurist pattern against the sky, but a windjammer's sails bellying in the breeze, the foam breaking away from her bows, white as milk, and wake behind them light green in a sea the colour of sapphire. No smoke, none of the stink of oil and coal below decks, none of the throbbing of the engines, just the sea and the wind. The thought made it all the more difficult to believe that a Japanese submarine had torpedoed the Steel Duke before dawn that morning. After midnight, that would be Landy's watch. He'd be down below. What chance would a man have caught like that? As a retired seaman who kept on sail to the last, Hoppy is a product of an earlier energy system and can barely comprehend the potential loss of his son to a torpedo fired from a diesel-powered submarine. Accordingly, his instinct is to escape into the past. His nostalgic imaginings erase all signs of carbon-intensive industry and restore a world energized by the natural rhythms of water and wind. But the horror of his son's likely violent death wrenches him back to the present. Readers are moved by Hoppy's grief and bewilderment, and Cusack harnesses that pathos as a critique of fossil fuel modernity. The attack on the Steel Duke also forces Barr to reckon with the negative consequences of the system with which he's so imbricated. Though he has kept his distance from his family at Roz's insistence, he visits the Bolton to comfort his father as they wait for news of Landy. There he meets his other brother, Rudd, whom he's not seen or spoken to for 8 years. A smaller presence in the novel than the other Sweet Apples, as a Communist Party organiser, Rudd's primary function as a character is to force Barr to articulate and defend his values. In the Bolton's kitchen, a site already symbolically charged by Mum's recreation there of the Bellbird disaster, the brothers engage in an argument that brings the forces of carbon capitalism and the fossil unconscious into direct confrontation. Rudd antagonises Barr by connecting the kind of weaponry used against Landy to the pig iron and scrap Australian steel companies sold to Japan in the lead up to the Pacific War. Speaking for the scientists, technologists, engineers, and executives, Barr retorts, "Where would we be in this war if it wasn't for the progress we've made in steelmaking and munitions, I'd like to know." Rudd responds that the cost of that kind of progress, millions of human lives and wholesale destruction, is too heavy a price. In this scene, Cusack strips the facade of manners to reveal the essential conflict at work, in what Brooks calls a moment of symbolic confrontation which fully articulates the terms of the drama. Accordingly, Barr comes close to acknowledging the fossil unconscious. Cusack writes, "Mum Bolton was watching him with eyes that besought him to give some comfort. Barr looked at her and then looked away. He didn't know why, but it made him feel uncomfortable. Damn silly, as if he was in some way to blame." In her role as the novel's moral touchstone, Mum provokes in Barr some sense of ethical culpability. As Rudd makes clear, Barr is implicated in a system whose most destructive impulses may have caused his brother's death. Cusack underlines the point as Barr begins to feel as though he was smothering in the cramped kitchen, an echo both of David sealed in the Bellbird mine and Landy suffocating in the iron dust-covered water. Barr's desire to escape these feelings of self-recrimination lead him to engage in an affair he thinks reconfirms his, quote, power and solidity. As he leaves the Bolton's kitchen, he collides with young Mai Mavers, the wife of a colleague now serving overseas. Desperate to unburden himself, he tells her about Landy and the Steel Duke. With her murmured words of sympathy acting as a balm to his nerves, by the time Barr parts from Mai, his sense of guilt has been washed away. His equilibrium is fully restored in their next meeting when, astonished at the amount of technical stuff she knows, he realizes he can discuss steel with her and that she seems enthralled by everything he said. Barr's affective relations have been so deranged by carbon capitalism that steelmaking is his only register for articulating sexual desire and its gratification. He describes nights with Mai as watching the flames in the retorts on the open hearth, watching the swirling incandescent gases. Desire and consummation flamed, but left him exalted and still desirous. Cusack's characterization departs most fully from realism with Mai. She's described as both a picture book princess and quite probably a nympho, and lives in a Hollywoodish flat, 3 descriptors which suggest that Cusack's primary aim with the character is not authenticity. Her obsessive love for her husband is matched only by an overwhelming sexual desire that leads her, in his absence, to make increasingly dangerous assignations with strange and sometimes violent men brought to the city by the war. While Barr is quickly infatuated, Mai's only interest in him is as a safe outlet for her desire until her husband returns. The hyperbole of Mai as a character allows for an allegorical reading of the affair as the entropic energy embedded in Barr's exuberant, erotic attachment to carbon power. It's for this reason that the relationship is consummated on the night Newcastle is shelled, so that afterwards, sight of the accoutrements of war, sandbags along the wall, the red buckets, all the NES equipment, raises in Bar a faint sense of pleasure. If it hadn't been for the raid, he never would have discovered how Mai felt. He would never have known he was capable of such ecstasy himself. If the affair can be read as the destructive impulse in carbon power, then Roz's understanding of it as a mess makes sense. It threatens the repressive clean sweep on which her life is based. It was this love triangle that critics said brought the novel closest to the verge of melodrama, as Vance Palmer wrote in Meanjin, using the term in its pejorative sense as synonymous with sensational and unrealistic writing. However, the scene in which Roz confronts Bar about the affair makes it clear that Cusack heightens her melodrama purposefully. Initially, Roz refuses to believe the rumour and is surprised when Bar appears shaken by it. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she tells him, "stop acting in that melodramatic way just because I've passed on a bit of gossip to you." This self-reflexive acknowledgement of the novel's primary mode frames what follows, as Roz tries in vain to resist both the truth of the affair and the melodrama of the moment. Finding herself in an absurdly theatrical situation she has never quite believed when she met it in stories or films, Roz resents behaviour in herself that she thinks is like the conventional, jealous wife of the magazine stories. Her body was tricking her into extravagant gestures she had never made before, Cusack writes. She tried to speak, but her throat was working and she couldn't get the words out. This moment of melodramatic mute gesture precedes the revelation of the scene. Bar wants to marry Mai and now believes his relationship with Roz has only ever been transactional. "I've just been a means to an end for you to get the things you wanted," he tells her. Cusack's description of the moment Roz's control slips reveals the larger purpose of the scene and plotline. Roz, she writes, could have willingly taken Mai and strangled her with her own hands. She was astonished at the force of her hatred, but this wasn't the way modern people behaved. Readers, however, know better. Melodrama is precisely the mode most appropriate for reckoning with the entropic energy and irrational violence embedded in modernity. While Bar's life disintegrates, Landy is granted a final, incredible, lovely spring of happiness. Having narrowly escaped death on the Steel Duke, he immediately marries his childhood sweetheart, Mum's daughter, Anne. During their honeymoon, she begs him to change to a ship carrying harmless cargo, and he reluctantly agrees. Under carbon capitalism, however, there is no such thing as harmless cargo, and his new ship is torpedoed. At the moment of impact, Landy is back again in the stokehole of the Steel Duke, as if time has rewound and his moment of joy never happened. In this climactic death scene, Cusack returns focus to coal and steel as the ultimate sources of the tragedy. When the submarine that fired the torpedo surfaces, Landy thinks it is so close he could have thrown a piece of coal onto its deck, while the source of his fatal injury is a piece of steel that strikes him as he runs from an explosion. Reader's last sight of Landy is his coffin being lowered into the dirty, discoloured sand of Newcastle's polluted ground, as his brothers silently agree that his death is such a stupid, tragic, damnable waste. Laid bare here is the fossil unconscious as a world of toxic seepage and collective human casualties that has always been part and parcel of the mineral order. Unable now to ignore this world, Bar is undone by guilt at his brother's death. Hemmed in by the crowd at the graveside, his mind runs in the same corroding circle with pictures of Landy. The end of the novel thus circles back and undoes the logic of Bar's triumphant entry into the narrative, replacing aerial exaltation with claustral despair and steel as world power with corrosion. Of Cusack's 10 single-authored novels, Southern Steel was the one most obviously marketed as a melodrama. On the cover of the first edition, a couple embraces, his blue shirt and her red dress, indicating their status as primal representations of and advertisements for suspense, sensation, and romance. The blurb spruiks a dramatic tale of family disunion, feminine rivalries, soldiers' lusts, and lovers' ecstasies. Cusack's publisher, UK firm Constable, clearly thought few would choose a novel about an Antipodean industrial city without these enticements. Cusack, too, recognised the efficacy of melodrama, though for more than its capacity to sell books. She ended From Coal to Steel, the second of her 2 Newcastle radio plays, with a telling exchange between the play's narrator and a woman interlocutor. In part, it reads, "Narrator, they've built a monument to coal. Perhaps they'll build one to steel. Woman, let them build monuments to the living. Narrator, to the living? Don't you know there are no memorials to the common people? Woman, save that the world endures. Narrator, you're a sentimentalist. That's romantic, you know, dramatizing ordinary life. Woman, but isn't life itself romantic? These lines illuminate the functioning of the melodramatic mode in Southern Steel, Cusack's testament to the drama of everyday life in fossil fuel modernity. In this context, she adapts her melodrama to reflect the polarized logics of coal, generating characters, situations, and plot structures that reflect its promise and peril, its exuberant promise, possibilities, and its catastrophic consequences. Thinking through Southern Steel as a resourceful melodrama allows us to take Cusack's aesthetics as seriously as her moral commitments. It also begins the work of assessing the impact of fossil fuel energy on the forms and preoccupations of Australian fiction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg. That was so much in that and so much to think about. I have a few questions, but I'll open it to the floor first if anyone has any questions.
I feel like I've run a marathon. I haven't done a talk that long for a while.
Coal melodrama marathon. Bridge. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful discussion. I was really interested in the theoretical framework which describes the fossil unconscious in terms of melodrama. So that's a gift, wonderful gift for this book. One question I had is how widely you think this applies in fiction of the time, not only Cusack, but elsewhere.
Yeah.
But also just the character of Roz, who I've only met having only read the first couple of chapters, and I've skimmed through and seen some of the, it was interesting hearing her story, and the kind of dialogue that you put up there at the moment of conflict. I just wondered whether, not having read the novel, this is a genuinely open question, wondering whether Roz kind of figures a kind of playing out of a tension between, if you like, socialist realism or realism and melodrama as competing energetics, if you like. And he's, as well as the kind of thematic kind of issues going on.
Yeah.
So that speaks then to the relation between realism and melodrama and their connection with modernity. Anyway, that's just a question that I have no idea how the book speaks about this.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember the first part of your question, how widely, I think if you mean in terms of melodrama as being a frame of reference for these writers more broadly, or do you mean in terms of fossil fuel stuff?
Either.
So I've only just begun the work of sort of tracing whether so Catherine Susanna Pritchard has written a couple of short stories about coal miners. So that question, put a pin in it, and I'll let you know in a few months. Melodrama, yes. Your wonderful essay on dark and melodrama is a case in point. That I think that a lot of the writers that we all know draw on melodrama. I think Cusack interests me because I don't know the degree to which she would have used that term, but I think she very much embraced a kind of outsized theatrical mode in her writing. And her use of speech, for instance, is quite different to, say, Stead's speech. It's a much more sort of people on a stage kind of delivering monologues or having these confrontations. And, her use of music and even lighting. There's a lot of attention in this novel to the lighting of the brownout and how the light brings out dark streaks in human beings. So I think that's why I think the theatrical elements are a little bit different with Cusack. Your insight about Roz is really interesting. The thing that I'm not convinced by my own reading of that final scene yet. I just think it's super interesting that she's trying to resist those parts of herself that are conforming with a melodrama, and that she, it doesn't, that aligns with trying to resist the truth of the affair and the falsity of her life. And I just think it's interesting, but I don't know what to do with it. So your idea about it, her kind of this tension between the social realism and the melodrama is very interesting, and I will pursue it. So thank you.
Cool.
Gail has a question.
Hi Meg, thanks. That was a wonderful paper. And I don't know the novel. So like Richard, I'm very interested in the conceptual framework, and particularly in this idea of narrative energetics. Was that I missed who
Graeme MacDonald.
Where derived from?
Yeah, so the paper, weirdly, he hasn't done a lot else in the area, but Graeme MacDonald, he's an American academic. It's a paper called The Resources of Fiction, which I can send to you. And it uses Italo Calvino's story about the petrol pump
Right.
as a place to start. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask about this idea of narrative energetics, do you think of it as a kind of model of tropology, that it's a tropological model about the tropes, the sort of rehearsal or the regime of tropes that is unfolding? Do you think of it as a model of character, since you talked about it as linked to the Brooks idea of melodrama as cathexis, as a kind of unrepressing of the political unconscious of the text as well as the personal unconscious? And I guess more interesting, or just as interesting to me, is the idea of energetics as the kind of hermeneutic drive of the text and the way in which the text gathers a kind of energy and sparks in different ways. So I guess that my first question would be if you could say a little more about that. And my second question is a banal one, which is whether Cusack knew Lawrence, because one of my postgrads has taken me back to Lawrence recently, and I'm very interested in that conversion in Lawrence between coal and erotics, so that coal, it's what you call its exuberance, its kind of flaming substance, that allotropic state. The coal is also this sort of channel to the erotics, if you like. And so I just wondered if that was another passing thought as you were reading. But thanks, it's such an exciting paper. Thank you.
Thank you. So for Lawrence, I've been reading his early Cole plays, and I was desperate to find out whether Cusack knew of Lawrence. I imagine I haven't yet found any reference to confirm that she did. She's got a quite a reasonable archive, which I haven't been able to spend much time with. And I think I think possibly her education and her interest in literature may have positioned her to miss the kind of English modernism. So she became quite enamored of American writers. So I don't know, and I haven't been able to speculate on that yet, because it seemed like an obvious connection to me. But in terms of Cusack's knowledge, I don't know. Your first question is wonderful. Thank you for thinking about energetics. I think in this paper, I'm interested in melodrama as a form of narrative energetics, in which case it's all of those things that you mentioned. It's tropological, it's character, it's pacing. So this novel, I do think it does gather itself to a point of explosion, and then the last scene is a silent scene at the funeral. This kind of in the aftermath of that. So I think this project, if it gets off the ground, it's going to be called Narrative Energies, Coal and Fossil Power in Australian Fiction. And it will be sort of taking that idea of energy and thinking through it a little bit more in terms of form and style and all of those things. So thank you for thinking about it.
Kath has a question.
Sorry, more a comment than a question, as they say. If you do think of this as a broader project, just to flag that there's heaps and heaps of extractive, mineral-oriented fiction in the newspapers in the 19th century and the early 20th century, you know, tapping into both the melodramatic and the nation forming and all that. So
yeah, thank you. I've been playing with the database actually, which is incredible. And I've found some really curious stuff. Mabel Forrest, there's a newspaper story by Mabel Forrest from I think 1912 in which a woman keeps a piece of coal in her jewelry box. And as she ages, this piece of coal becomes to represent her aging as it represents the aging of the earth. It's very curious and interesting and wonderful. So I'll definitely be writing something about that. But yes, I think looking for coal in fiction, I think newspaper fiction is going to be a major source for that. And I'm really interested. And the wonderful database facilitates that, which is great.
Yeah, well, let me know if you want to chat anytime about like sort of more flexible ways of searching it than the public interface or anything like that.
Awesome, thanks.
Just on the back of that question, and my question is sort of complicated, so I think I'm just going to have to grapple and get it out in a certain way. So it's a question about immediacy in relation to both melodrama and the unconscious. So in relation to melodrama, and this Kat's question about newspapers made me think of it, but also there are various other communications media mentioned, magazines, Hollywood film. And so this sense that melodrama is very now and that Cusack is narrating something that is happening now. And this is something that I thought about when I wrote my book about melodrama, is that part of the discomfort with it is something to do with the way in which it taps into something that's happening now that maybe literature hasn't quite caught up with, or other forms of literature haven't. But mainstream media are very good at generating what's happening now. And melodrama is often tapping into these immediate forms around it. And I guess and apologies for the complicated nature of the question, but I had a thought about what that means in terms of the fossil unconscious as it's acting on the body. I mean, the destruction for breathing. And, you know, in some ways, there's nothing more immediate than our own breathing, but it's also the thing that we have to forget in order to do. Because if we think about how we breathe, our breathing changes. So there's something interesting there about breathing as this kind of necessarily unconscious activity that we do to be alive. Yet the thing that we don't think about, or necessarily don't think about. And something about immediacy and these media surrounding the novel. And the novel necessarily takes more time to write than, you know, getting out a newspaper article or a magazine article. A film takes a lot longer, but there's something also immediate about photography. So I hope that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, there's so much in that question. So the first thing that came to my mind is that Cusack was critiqued for that immediacy. I can't remember who it was, a critic who said she needs to take longer to digest her ideas before she writes about them, because she's so anxious to put things on the page, and she just needs to slow down. It was a bit of a settle down, you crazy woman type of review. But that's interesting, you know, that there was a sense that she was a writer who was responding to the moment. She was writing newspaper articles when she was in Newcastle. So she wrote about the shelling of Newcastle, and she related to it in that way, as that sense of immediacy. And I don't know why I'm so fascinated by the idea of her dictating fiction, but I think that lends a sense of immediacy to it as well, because it's spoken voice. Yeah, and there's a less opportunity to sit and read back what you're writing, and the way that you can with a typewriter. You're speaking it as this, and some of her dictated novels are in the NLA. I haven't had a chance to listen to them, but I'd love to. So yes, and connected to breathing, the run that I had with Landy being suffocated as he gets torpedoed, and the references to him taking on iron dust and not being able to breathe. I also thought about other moments when breath is referenced, and there's a lot of intakes of breath and that we get in melodrama, but I haven't. It's interesting that you mention that and connect that to the kind of fossil unconscious in a way that I think I could probably think about a little bit more. I guess a complicating factor with this is she drafted the novel in 1946, but rewrote it in 1950. So there is a bit of distance there. And I did wonder whether you could sort of start to see some different preoccupations in the character of Roz too, that I felt were later preoccupations. And, you know, you could sort of almost start to see a little bit of 50s cinema coming in there, that I did wonder about the impact of that as well. So yes, thank you for your thoughts. And my answers weren't very good, but
no, that's fantastic. And just one note, I think Bridget wants to ask a question. In the melodrama that I wrote about in my book, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Pygmalion version of Pygmalion, breath is essential, and part of the grammar of melodrama, that there's sort of a breath between the music and the speech. The statue, when she comes to life, breathes, sighs, turns away. So, and essential to melodrama also is this arresting moment, this pause in the drama, which is also there in Brooks. So that's just a thing to think of if there are moments of breath in
because
Cusack.
That just made me think of the steel making process itself. It's oxygen. It's supplying and denying oxygen. I had to ask my dad because I was reading about it and I didn't understand it. He used to work in a foundry. But yeah, that steel is produced in blast furnaces through the supplying and denial of oxygen. So because that scene with the steel making is so crucial, I think, and it's in that. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you. Bridget, did you have a question again?
Oh, the moment's passed. I was just going to add a text into the discussion. Elizabeth Harrow was The Long Prospect, which, you know, very much located in similar terrain, but I'd have to have a think about whether there are applicable connections, you know, and I guess too it would have been written around about the same time, although it's looking back to an interwar period, I think. The other strange thought I kept having was about Oppenheimer, the movie,
which I haven't seen because I've been writing this paper.
Yeah, well, you'll have to go out and see it, because I think there's a bit of fossil unconscious, well, just a tad fossil unconscious going on there. Anyway, that's it. It was nothing consequential.
I thought of a reference to Meg, partly because the conference I'm about to go to, Lars Jensen is speaking, and I don't know if you know, but he's written a book on extractive literature in Australia.
Oh, really?
And that's quite a big project of his, and I think the paper at the conference that I'm about to go to is also on extraction, so I can put you two in touch if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
He's from Denmark, and he's also written about post-colonial. His framework is post-colonial.
Okay.
But also anti-capitalist, and you know.
Great, awesome. Thank you.
Good.
Any other questions? I guess I just have one more question, which is about gender and melodrama. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like you mentioned a maternal melodrama going on at one point in relation to mum and Ba, but then that kind of gets displaced to this Mai as a kind of femme fatale or something, villainous figure. But otherwise, it also seems like a sort of male melodrama in terms of Landy and the powerlessness of working men in a coal mine. I'm wondering if you haven't had any thoughts about.
Yeah. So originally, I had a lot more with the maternal melodrama angle, because there is quite a lot of references to Roz's relationship to her son. And, you know, her son is Daryl, mum's is David. And there's a narrative there about maternal responsibility that mirrors, and of course, mum is you know, she's the idealized mother figure. She has no other name. And she, yeah, so gender, I think there's two. I think there's a kind of women's melodrama happening with Mum and Roz and Mai, and even with Mai, she is a kind of type, a trope, but Cusack does try to admit some complexity in the fact that, you know, the responsibility is ultimately on the war. You know, it's these social and existential forces that are the true sources of evil and victimization. But yes, I do think there's also, and Ba is the figure who, you know, undergoes the kind of polarized transition from the total heights to the total depths at the end. And it's very much his narrative, I think. And Landy is a kind of foil for that as well, the kind of tragic figure there. But yeah, I haven't really figured it out a way to properly articulate the gender dynamics within this framework of the fossil unconscious. And
Oh, I don't think you necessarily have to. Yeah, I mean, I think you're already doing great stuff without having to go to that. And lots of people talk about gender and melodrama. But yeah,
I did read a lot about it. And I watched all of Douglas Sirk's films.
Oh, great. Yes.
Which is fantastic.
Speaking of film, Bronwyn Levy has asked in the comments about your mention of How Green Was My Valley, the film. Have you looked at the novel, which was read quite widely in Australia, but before World War II?
Thank you, Bronwyn. I haven't looked at the novel yet. I plan to. I did. So quite a few of Cusack's books are at the National Library. So I did look through her books to see what she had on her shelves and know How Green Was My Valley. But I guess this project I do, without it getting to be too, you know, large, I do want to kind of think about coal and the other texts that were circulating at the time. And I know that the novel is reasonably different, I think, from the film. So I will read it. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we can let Meg off the hook. So thank you for a wonderful paper and brilliant answers to all those questions. Wonderful to hear that, and I very much look forward to reading the next iteration of the fantastic thing. As Bridget said, I think it is a gift, this fossil unconscious, for thinking about this novel. So many thanks, Meg, and thank you to everyone for coming along at this later CALC time, which I know suits a Berlin time and suits WA, so I think we'll keep doing it. But thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your questions.